I'm happy to see that you also decided to join the next part of the tutorial, or the second part, where we are going to continue working on that scene actually. So what can you expect to learn from the tutorial? We are going to build an extra object, which is going to be something similar than that rack over here. So we are not going to do exactly the same rack, because I think that's a bit old-fashioned, like the whole wooden look and everything. So we are going to do a more simpler and modern version of it. But of course, we need to incorporate all the features that you find in that rack as well. So there are going to be 2 planes. The top one has the holes in it, the lower one has those hollow areas in it where the tube is basically put in and held in place. By constructing that rack, you are going to learn how to handle one new modifier, and that modifier is actually quite handy to know for multiple things. We are going to use it to build the rack, and we are going to use the same modifier also to do some more details on the floor on our lab table basically. Good. Before we start, I would recommend that we clean up our scene a bit and reorganize it a bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to delete the beaker, because this is something we don't need anymore, and also I'm going to delete the liquid that was inside of the beaker. I'm going to keep the molecule because I would like to use that one as an element in the background. So I'm not going to delete that, but I'm going to rename and reorganize my groups and collections here. So this would be the collection of the molecule. And this is the collection of our test tubes. So I'm also going to rename that one, because this will also hold our files for the rack then. And this is the collection with the background, the lamp, and the camera. We are going to keep that as it is. Since the molecule is sitting here somewhere in the middle of our scenes, I'm going to hide that molecule, and I can do that by just hiding the complete group, which is quite convenient, so that it's not distracting when we are going to build the rack. I am also going to delete those 2 tubes and the liquid that was in the inside, and we are going to continue working with the one single tube that we have here. To make it easier to recognize, I'm going to also give the tube a name, so that we don't mix it up with something else. And also the liquid on the inside. The tube is going to be essential for forming our rack, and I'm going to duplicate the cube now, because we would like to keep one as it is for filling the rack afterwards. I'm also going to, because I think I forgot at the beginning, I'm going to activate the screencast. So here you see what kind of keys I'm using in case I'm using shortkeys. Now I'm just going to duplicate the tube. I'm going to select both the tube and the liquid, then I'm going to hit Shift D and put it out of my view, because this is just the backup here. Keep in mind that the new tube that we formed and the new liquid basically have the number 001 at the end. So don't use those 2 objects, because those should be the untouched one. To make sure that I'm not going to confuse them, I'm also going to lock them by clicking on the arrow here, so I cannot select them by accident. We don't need the liquid that is on the inside of our tube, so I'm going to delete that as well. Good. One thing before we start building our rack is we are going to prepare the tube, the test tube now, so that it's suitable for doing our rack. If you remember the last tutorial, we actually applied a couple of modifiers to that one tube. And now, since we are using it to build another object, we can actually get rid of some of those modifiers. For example, the Bevel Modifier is something we don't need now, because there are no corners that need to be rounded, so I can delete that. And also the Solidify modifier is also something we don't need. I'm going to keep the Subdivision modifier, because that gives us the smooth look of the cube, and also allows us to make nicer cuts in the end. So you are going to see what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. And for this now, I'm going to apply the modifier actually. So this is the tube that we are working with. The second tiny thing that we need to do is we need to make it a bit larger. We are using that tubes to cut the holes into the plane that is basically our rack, or visible in our rack. So that cube is actually cutting the holes here and also making those hollow parts. Since the holes need to be larger than the tube, we also need to make the tube that is cutting the holes a bit larger. I'm going to go into top view because then it's easier to see what I'm doing. I'm just selecting the tube, hitting S for scale, and then I'm just going to scale it up a bit. The next step that we need to do is we need to insert a plane that we are using as one part of the rack. We are not going to use a plane in that case, we are rather going to use a cube, because this one is easier to modify. So the only modifications that we need to do is basically we need to scale it down and we need to make it a bit longer. I'm going to keep it like this now, and we're going to do some fine tuning afterwards. Now you see already what I meant with using the tube to cut the holes. So you can leave the arrangement as it is, like this. But of course, we would like to have an array of holes, not only one. And there is a very handy modifier to do that, and that's the one that you are going to be introduced in that tutorial. And that's the array modifier here. The array modifier is actually very simple. It creates an array of one object, so you can decide how many duplications you would like to have, and also the alignment can be defined by that modifier. I would like to get a rack that has 6 times or 6 holes for our test tubes, and I would also change the alignment in that case, and this can be done in that section over there. So there is a subsection which is called relative offset, which is set to 1 now on the x-axis. But I would like to have that on the y-axis going in this direction, and there should be a tiny gap in between the objects, or in this case in between our test tubes. I'm going to set the x value to 0, so it seems like nothing happened because all of them moved at the same spot. And then I'm going to, let's try 1.5. I'm going to add 1.5 for the y offset. And that looks actually really good already. I think that's a good gap between our test tubes. Now I'm just going to modify the plane a bit, so the part of our rack. And I'm going to do that in the top view, because then I can nicely see if my plane is nicely aligned with the tubes. And I'm also going to make it a bit smaller. I'm not going to do 2 rows in comparison to what we have for that rack over there. So I'm going to stay with only 1 row, but of course you could easily do the second row as well. It's basically just repeating the same steps. It's actually even easier to do that with the modifier. I'm just going to show you quickly how to do it, just in case you would like to actually have 12 spots for your rack. So you could apply a second array modifier, and this would be the second row that you need. So you just need to change the offset in this case as well, so that there is a bit of space between the rows, and that would be your second row for a 12 slot rack. But as I said, I'm going to stay with the 6 slot rack because then it's less crowded in the scene. Then, as we saw, there is the second plane that we need at the bottom. So I'm just going to duplicate the first one that we made, and I'm going to drag it down. And here it's just important to see, or to make sure that the tube should not be sticking through our plane. And the easiest way to do that is to go into the front view by hitting 1, and then just position the plane so that only part, or only half of the end of the tube is basically inside of the plane. Approximately, I think like this. Maybe we can go up a bit. That looks good. Then The next step is actually something we already learned on how to do. So we are going to use those tubes now to cut the holes into our plane. I'm going to apply the array modifier, and then I'm just going to select the plane, go to the modifier tab again and select the Boolean modifier. And as an object, I'm going to select the tubes. Then hit apply, and that's it. Don't delete the tubes in that case, keep them, because we are going to reuse them, of course, for the second part. Select the second plane that we created and do exactly the same as we did before. Apply a Boolean modifier, select the tube, hit apply, and that's it. And now we can delete the tubes. And what we are left with now is actually the holes and the tiny hollow areas. I just need to move that up a bit because you saw it was actually colliding with our floor. So it looked a bit weird basically. So I'm going to move that up. And this is the basic part of our rack. So the only things that we need to add now is those side parts, and this is super easy to do. So we can make a cube again as the basic form, and then we are just going to scale that down as well. Move it to the side, make it a bit higher. It's a bit too high, and I'm going to move it down a bit so that it does not cover the side too much, so that this tube is nicely visible still. And duplicate that object again, move it to the other side, and that would basically be it. I'm just going to make them a bit smaller. Yeah. And this is now the basic shape for our rack. So you see it was not overly much to do. So the only thing that we need to do now is we need to fill it with our test tubes. Don't forget to unlock them now, and then just select them and then move it to the rack and try to align them in the right position. I'm going to start with that position here again. And I try to find a nice alignment in the middle. This of course doesn't need to be 100% perfect, because in real life also the tube doesn't sit 100% in the middle, and also position it nicely in the groove that we formed here. Looks great. You can now either position all the tubes by hand again, or you could also use the modifier. I'm going to quickly just do it by hand, because I think in that case I'm a bit faster than by just using the modifier. But just imagine if you have something like 20 tubes that you would like to duplicate, the modifier of course would be a good option. And since already the distance between the tubes is defined by the holes that we made before, it's also easy to do it by hand. So I'm just going to duplicate that object and drag it to the next place. And I'm going to repeat that actually 6 times. We could also do it in a faster way, so that we just select the 3 tubes that we made already, do a duplication again, and move all of them. Perfect. So this is our filled rack now. If I go into the rendered mode, we see how it looks like already. And that actually looks really nice. What I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to change the color of the liquids. I would like to have something like a gradient going from a very light blue to a darker blue. That's of course also something that you know already how to do. You just enter the material properties menu, then you select the first one over there. The numbering here is a bit weird now, so you see it starts from 0, but the first one should be 5. I'm going to leave that one untouched. The next one is the one with the number 4 in my case. Don't forget to unlink the color, so click just on the number, then it's unlinked, and then just go for a stronger or a darker blue. The next one is this one, unlink, select the color. Unlink again and change the color. Also in that case unlink. And the last one, should be the darkest one. So now we have something like a gradient of different blues. I think that one actually could be a bit darker. That's that one. That's very similar. That looks a bit better. For the material of the rack that we have, I'm going to choose something like a metal shader, and I'm going to go for the glossy shader, but not in the overly shiny version like you would have it here, so that it looks like a mirror. So I'm going to add roughness, and I'm going to go for a roughness around 0.4. And I'm going to apply, of course, that shader to all the other parts of the rack. So that would be the side part of the rack, and also the lower part of the rack. A short hint as well: if you create an object like the rack, for example, and you would like to have the single parts of the object combine into one object, there is also a very handy command. So you just select all of the parts, and then you hit Command J for join, and then all of those objects are joined into one part, which is quite convenient also, because here in the menu you only have one part, and if you don't want to modify them afterwards, joining is always a good idea. If you would like to modify them afterwards again, so if you would like to separate those things again, you need to go into the edit mode by hitting tab and then pressing P for separate, and then just say by loose parts, and then you can modify the single parts again. Of course, I'm not going to do that now because I would like to keep everything joined. So this is what our rack would look like now. Since we already used the array modifier, I'm going to show you now a second object that you can create with the array modifier, and this is tiling or tiles for the floor or for the surface of our table here. So the tile itself is nothing overly complicated. It's basically just a cube that we are going to scale down, also make it a bit smaller, and I'm going to apply a modifier, which is also a modifier that we used before, and that's the Bevel Modifier. So with the Bevel Modifier, we can make sure that we have a tile-like look, because the edges are normally not very sharp of the tile edges. So to have the round corners, the Bevel Modifier is perfect for that. And then, as I said before, the second modifier in that case would be the array modifier. In this case, we also need to change the offset a bit. I would recommend 1.03. So the gaps are a bit tinier here. And then we're just going to say 10 tiles in one direction. Then we just add another modifier, which is always added at the end of the modifier list. And then instead of using the x-axis, we are going to use the y-axis again. Entering the same value as for the first modifier. I'm going to collapse that again. And oops, I forgot to change the count and also go for something like 10. It might be that we need more afterwards, so we can change that, of course. And then just drag the tiles so that they fit perfectly with the walls. So make sure that the wall does not cut the tile somewhere in the middle, because that would not be like you would start laying your tiles. So it should be perfectly positioned. Then, of course, we need to go down. We do not delete the plane that we have underneath it, because this is going to serve now as the part that shines through between the tiles. So try to align it nicely, that there is a bit of, so that the tiles are they are standing out of the plane basically, but not overly much. And as a material for our tiles, I'm going to go for something very simple as well. I'm going to use the principal shader that's actually perfect for tiles, where I just go down with the roughness so that I have nice white glossy tiles. The plane that is underneath it, also for that, I'm going to go for something very basic. I'm going to use a diffuse shader with a light gray, because normally the parts in between the tiles are not white, so they are normally rather dirty or grayish, and this is exactly what we are going for. So let's see how that looks like now. Sometimes it needs a bit of tweaking. I think that actually fits nice. That looks nice. There is not overly much reflection going on our tiles now, even though they are glossy. But that's something that's going to increase when we are going to change a bit about the lighting and also about the amount of objects that are there. I think I can actually increase the steps a bit. I think that was a bit too low. And also the corners there, I think they are a bit sharp. I'm just going to improve the tiles a bit, so something I forgot before, I'm going to just add the smooth shading so that you see like the corners are really smooth and nice. So let's go back to the rendered view now. I think that actually looks nice. I'm not 100% satisfied with it. So I'm going to move them down. That's a bit too much. Sometimes it's a bit hard to find the perfect position. And quite often, to be honest, you see if it's too much or too low, or too high or too low in that case, when you do the final rendering and then you need to change it again. So that's the reason why I'm a bit hesitant about the height here. That was, of course, way too much. That looks like a nice position to me. Good, I'm going to keep that. The second thing that I promised you was also we are going to use the molecule again as some kind of decoration in the background. So I'm going to unhide it again, and to make it easier for us now to navigate with the molecule, I'm going to hide the rest. So I'm going to hide the test tube, and also I'm going to hide the floor. Now select all of the parts of the molecule, scale it up a bit, and also find the right position that you would like to have. I would like to somehow lean it to the wall, so I'm going to move it back a bit and also towards the corner, but I would still like to have it be nicely visible, so not completely covered by the rack. So let's give that a try. If we unhide the rack again, I'm also going to select everything from the rack except for the floor. The floor should stay where it is. So I'm going to lock that and move that a bit to that side here, so that we have a bit more space for our molecule to be visible. I think we can even make it larger. It does not necessarily need to be completely in the image, so if we cut it here, that's totally fine. And then move it a bit towards the wall. I think this is a nice position. Let's see how that looks like. That's actually nice. Then I'm just going to do a tiny modification with our light. So you see that that's the same light as we had for the previous scene, and the light is actually going towards the rack. What I would like to have now is that the light is rather coming from this direction, because quite often if you have liquids or glass-like materials, it actually gives a nice effect when the light goes through those kind of materials. So I'm just going to change the rotation value on the y-axis to have it come from that direction. You don't need to change the position of the light, at least not for a sun, because the sun is basically affecting the complete scene anyway. So it's enough if you just change the rotation here, so that it basically comes from that side and goes through our tubes. So let's see how that looks like. I think that's a bit much now, but the effect that I wanted to achieve is actually nicely visible already. So you see now, since we have a glossy surface for our rack, we see that there is reflection of our liquids on the table, basically, or on the surface of the rack, and this is what I wanted to have. I also think it's actually quite interesting that there is a bit of a shadow in the background as well. I think it's a bit too much, so I'm going to go with a lower value for the y-axis of the lamp, so probably something like -8. I think that looks nice. And I'm also going to add a different intensity, because I think 3 is a bit much. So I'm going to go for, let's say, 1.5 for the sun, because I'm going to add some emission planes as we had before as well. This is nothing that is highly necessary here, but since we have the glass material, it's always nice to have something that is actually reflected in the glass material. And that can be achieved by just adding those planes. I explained before how to do those planes. I'm just going to do them quickly now as well. So add the plane. I'm going to move them here so it's nicer visible. Just duplicate that plane as well, and duplicate those planes again. Then give it a new material, which is just a normal emission shader, and assign a name to that one, and then just assign the same material to all the other planes. I'm going to do the same thing as I did before with the rack. So I'm going to join those planes so that I don't need to worry about losing one of them. Then I'm just going to rotate the plane and put it a bit closer to the rack. Sometimes it's hardly visible in the preview version of the render, but afterwards when we do the final render, it should be nicely visible. If you would like to have a bit of extra lighting or extra reflections, you can actually duplicate that plane as well, move it up as well, and you can make it a bit smaller and also tilt it a bit, so that now you would have something like a second object that can be reflected. You might have also recognized when looking at your molecule now that there is actually an extra atom in the middle here that was not visible before. For whatever reason, that happens if you transfer one molecule to another Blender file, that suddenly the so-called dummy atom becomes visible. But don't worry about that, just ignore it. It's not going to be visible in the final render. So you just see it here, and also in the preview, I think. Yeah, it's still visible here, but it's not going to be in your final render. So just ignore that and don't get distracted by that. I'm going to do a bit of styling for my molecule now, since this is the one that we first imported and does not contain any kind of coloring. And you also see that the bonds are still two-colored, so I'm going to do that quickly. And afterwards, we are going to actually do a modification to the camera to get an effect that is normally something you see very often in photography and makes your image a bit more realistic. So I'm going to quickly log off to make the styling of the molecule, and then we are going to continue with the camera. And I'm back after doing some tiny modifications to the molecule. So as you see, I just changed the color of the atoms and also the material. I basically did the same as we did in the first tutorial as well. So nothing very special. I did a bit of repositioning because I wanted to have the ring a bit more visible, and it should look like it's more or less lean to the wall. So, and this is also something, depending on the molecule that you have, you might do some extra tweaking on that. Take your time to do those kind of modifications. It's normally worth it. Before we've rendered that image now, we are going to do for the first time some modifications on our camera or change the settings a bit. Until now, we left the settings as they are, but there is something that gives your image some kind of realistic touch, and that's called depth of field. This is something you might also know from real-life photography, especially if you do macro photography. That means we are going to decide to have a focus area that is in focus, and everything that's behind or in front of that area is normally a bit blurry. And this is something that Blender can actually do as well, and that's very easy, but very powerful to do. So first you select your camera, and as soon as you do that, there is a new menu popping up, which is the tiny camera over there, and then there is the sub-menu, which is depth of field, and you just activate that one. And in addition to that, above it, there is something called Viewport Display, and here you just click on limits. This allows you to see where the focal area basically is, and also to change the position of the focal area easier, because you can see where you basically navigate. If you go back into solid mode and go into the top mode, you see the orange cross over there, and this is the exact space of the focal area. So you have two options now to set that focus on a specific object. You can either just use, I'm going to close that. You can either use the distance. So by just changing the value of the distance, you see that the cross is actually moving towards the camera or going more to the back of your scene. Or you can select an object where the focus should be. In this case, I would like to have the focus on the third test tube. So I can go ahead, just use the eyedropper tool again, go to the test tube and just click on it. And then the focus area is automatically aligned to the test tube. If I go back into camera mode again and go into rendered, you see that actually not a lot of things have changed. So it looks very similar, because we did not change any of the values that you can change here. The most important value is the f-stop, also something, if you're into photography, you might know that already. Unfortunately, it does not behave exactly as it would be in photography. Normally you go down to values something like 1.4. That's already super low already in macro photography. But for Blender, you can go down to values that are super low. Since the f-stop is a value that has a connection between the distance of the camera and the object, it can be in Blender very low, because of course we do not simulate how the scene would be in real life. So our camera might be too close to the object, it might be too far away, it might be too large, and so on and so forth. So in this case, you can easily go down to 0.5, for example. And I think I can even go further, something like 0.3. At a certain point, you start to see already that there is something going on in the background, that certain areas and also the things that are in behind and in front of your focal point are getting blurry already. Let's go down even further so that you just see the effect. 0.1 is probably a bit too much, but now you see the effect very strongly. I think I stay with 0.25. And let's give that one a try and see what the final outcome is. Before we're going to do the final render, I'm going to do a short modification to the material of our floor, because I would like to have more reflection on the floor of the elements that are around. The basic principle shader that we applied here is actually, it's really nice, but you see, if there is not a lot of surrounding, there is not a lot of reflection in the floor. And you can actually get more reflection by just changing the metallic value. And I'm going to go up to something like 0.5. And as you see already in the preview, the surroundings are going to be better reflected. And here you also see that there is a reflection of our molecule starting to appear. And this is exactly the effect that I would like to have on the floor. Good. I think those are the modification for the scene. I'm going to do a final rendering now, and let's see afterwards what the outcome looks like. And this is now the final outcome from the rendering. I'm actually pretty happy with how it looks like, especially the reflection and the blur in the background is something I actually really like. Good. I hope you're also satisfied with your results. And as always, I hope that you also join me in the next tutorial.